The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, as if God himself had spilled his palette across the heavens. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of dry grass under a faint breeze that carried with the scent of dust and leather. It was late afternoon when Sheriff Ethan Carter rode into the small town of Willow Creek, his horse weary from days on the trail. He wasn't there to enforce the law. His badge hung loosely around his neck, more decoration than duty, but rather because he'd heard whispers of something strange happening at the old Miller Ranch. Ethan dismounted near the general store, tying his horse to a post with practiced ease. His boots kicked up clouds of dirt as he walked toward the saloon, its swinging doors creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. But tucked in one corner sat an older man, his face etched with lines deeper than any canyon carved by time. This was Jacob Miller, patriarch of the Miller family, whose ranch lay just outside of town. His expression was grim, his hands gripping a glass of whiskey so tightly it seemed ready to shatter. "Sheriff," Jacob called out, his voice low and gravelly. "Come sit. You've got yourself a story worth hearing." Ethan pulled up a chair, leaning forward slightly as Jacob took a long drink before beginning. "It's my horse, Thunder," Jacob said, shaking his head. "He's refused to drink water. For 3 days now. Not a drop." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Horses were creatures of habit, their instincts often tied closely to survival. Refusing water wasn't unheard of, but it was rare and troubling. "Maybe he's sick?" Ethan suggested. Jacob shook his head again, more vigorously this time. "No sickness. I've checked him over myself, and Doc Harper came out yesterday. Clean bill of health. But still no water." Little did we know. His voice trailed off, and Ethan could see the weight pressing down on the man's shoulders. Whatever was happening at the ranch, it wasn't just about a stubborn animal. By morning, Ethan found himself riding alongside Jacob and his son, Samuel, heading toward the Miller Ranch. The land stretched out before them like an endless sea of brown and green, dotted here and there with clusters of scrubby bushes. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and heavy. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, as though they too sensed the tension hanging over the place. As they approached the ranch, the scene grew even more desolate. The once lush field showed signs of neglect, the crops wilting under the unforgiving sun. A wooden fence encircled the property, some sections sagging or broken entirely. At the center stood the main house, its paint peeling away like skin shedding after fever. Behind it loomed the barn, dark and imposing against the pale blue sky. Thunder stood tethered near the trough, his massive form casting a shadow over the water within. As Ethan dismounted, he noticed immediately how the horse shifted uneasily, ears twitching back and forth as if listening for something only he could hear. The trough itself was simple enough, a large, weathered wooden basin filled with clear water, reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. "See for yourself," Jacob said, gesturing toward the horse. "He won't touch it." Samuel stepped closer, reaching out to pat Thunder's flank. The horse snorted, stepping back sharply as if startled. "Dad reckons it's the water," Samuel muttered, glancing sideways at Ethan. "But what could be wrong with it? It's fresh, right out of the well." Ethan knelt beside the trough, dipping his fingers into the cool liquid. It felt normal enough, clean and refreshing. He cupped some in his hand and brought it to his lips, taking a cautious sip. Nothing tasted amiss. Yet Thunder continued to pace anxiously, avoiding the trough altogether. "Something's spooking him," Ethan murmured, standing up straight. "But what?" For hours, they tried everything imaginable. They cleaned the trough thoroughly, refilled it with fresh water from the well, even added a splash of apple juice to entice the horse. Still, Thunder refused. By late afternoon, frustration began to boil over. "It's nonsense," Jacob exclaimed, slamming his fist against the side of the barn. "A fine stallion like Thunder doesn't act this way without reason. Something's not right here." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "We need to look closer. Maybe there's something hidden beneath the surface." With that, the three men set to work. Using shovels and buckets, they carefully emptied the trough, draining every last drop of water onto the parched earth below. What they discovered left them all speechless. Buried deep within the muddy bottom of the trough was a human skull. Its hollow eyes stared up at them, silent and accusing. Teeth gnashed together in a permanent grimace, while bits of flesh and hair still clung to its edges, decomposing slowly in the damp darkness. Someone or something had been lurking in the water, unseen until now. Jacob staggered backward, clutching his chest as though trying to hold his heart in place. "Good Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling. Who would do such a thing? Ethan crouched down, examining the skull closely. There were marks on it, jagged grooves that looked suspiciously like knife wounds. Whoever this person had been, their death hadn't been peaceful. Samuel knelt beside Ethan, his young face pale but determined. "Do you think it's one of the drifters who passed through last month? Pa said 2 of them disappeared after stopping by the ranch." "It's possible," Ethan replied, though his mind raced with other possibilities. The skull bore no immediate identifying features, making it difficult to determine exactly who it belonged to. But one thing was certain. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. As night fell, the air grew cooler, carried with the faint chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote. The stars above twinkled brightly, yet somehow felt colder than usual. Ethan lit a lantern, its golden glow illuminating the area around the trough. Together, the trio began searching the surrounding ground, hoping to uncover more clues. It wasn't long before Samuel let out a sharp cry. Kneeling near a patch of disturbed soil, he held up another bone, a femur, its length unmistakable. More digging revealed additional remains, scattered haphazardly as though tossed carelessly aside. Whoever had buried the skull had clearly intended to leave no trace behind. But then, something else caught Ethan's eye. Half buried in the dirt was a piece of fabric, partially rotted but still recognizable. Pulling it free, he examined it closely. It was part of a shirt, dyed red with dried blood. Sewn into the collar was a small emblem, a crescent moon surrounded by stars. Recognition dawned on Ethan's face. "This belongs to the Wanderers," he said grimly. "They're a notorious gang of bandits known to terrorize these parts. Last I heard, they were holed up somewhere north of here." Jacob frowned deeply. "You mean one of them ended up in my trough?" "Looks that way," Ethan confirmed. "But why? And who put them there?" Questions swirled unanswered in the night air, heavy and oppressive. The discovery of the bones explained Thunder's refusal to drink, but it raised far more concerns than it resolved. If the Wanderers were involved, danger likely lurked nearby. Determined to get answers, Ethan decided to venture further into the wilderness, following leads that might connect the remains to the gang. Jacob and Samuel agreed to stay behind, keeping watch over the ranch while maintaining secrecy about the grisly find. Word spreading too quickly could bring unwanted attention and trouble under the cover of darkness. Ethan saddled his horse and headed north, guided only by the flickering light of his lantern and the stars overhead. The landscape shifted gradually, giving way to denser foliage and rocky terrain. Somewhere ahead, he knew, answers awaited if he dared seek them. Little did he know, however, that the truth was far darker than anything he'd imagined. The journey north was grueling, each mile stretching out like an eternity beneath the watchful gaze of the moon. Ethan's horse plodded forward with steadfast determination, its hooves kicking up clouds of dust that swirled in the cool night air. The land grew wilder as he ventured deeper into uncharted territory, where the rules of civilization seemed to fade away like echoes of forgotten time. Trees loomed tall and gnarled, their branches twisting into eerie silhouettes against the starlit sky. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, taunting him with half-formed shapes that disappeared upon closer inspection. Ethan tightened his grip on the reins, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of his revolver. He had faced danger before, bandits, outlaws, and desperate men, but this felt different. This was a kind of unease that crept into your bones, whispering warnings you couldn't ignore. Yet he pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and curiosity that refused to let him turn back. By dawn, he reached the edge of a dense forest, its canopy so thick it blotted out most of the sunlight. The air here was cooler, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Birds chirped cautiously from their perches, their calls soft and fleeting, as though wary of disturbing something ancient and hidden within the woods. Ethan dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby sapling before stepping cautiously into the shadows. The forest floor was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip him at every step. Vines hung low, swaying gently in the breeze, while patches of moss clung stubbornly to the trunks of ancient oaks. Ethan moved slowly, his boots crunching softly against the carpet of fallen leaves. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, making even the rustle of his own breath feel intrusive. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon the first sign of human presence. A campfire pit, its ashes cold but recent enough to suggest it hadn't been used more than a few days ago. Scattered around it were remnants of meals, broken bones, scraps of cloth, and bits of metal twisted beyond recognition. Ethan knelt down, examining the debris closely. Among the refuse, he spotted another crescent moon emblem, identical to the one found on the shirt fragment back at the ranch. His heart quickened. The Wanderers had been here. But why? What brought them to this isolated stretch of wilderness? As he stood, his eyes caught movement further ahead, a flicker of light through the trees. Instinctively, he ducked behind a large boulder, drawing his revolver as he peered cautiously over the edge. Through the foliage, he could make out the faint outline of a structure, a cabin crude but sturdy, nestled deep within the heart of the forest. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, carried away by the wind. Around it, several figures moved about, their forms obscured by distance and shadow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Bandits. There could be no doubt about it. They moved with the confidence of men who believed themselves unseen, unaware of the intruder watching them from the underbrush. Carefully, he holstered his weapon and retreated farther into the woods, ensuring he wouldn't be spotted. From a safe distance, he studied the scene before him. The cabin appeared abandoned, except for the bandits' temporary occupation. Its walls were weathered, marked with scratches and gouges that told stories of battles fought long ago. A well stood off to one side, its bucket hanging precariously from a rope frayed with age. Nearby, horses grazed lazily, tethered to posts driven deep into the ground. Everything about the place screamed isolation, a perfect hideout for those seeking refuge from the law. Yet something about the setup didn't sit right with Ethan. The bandits seemed restless. Their movements lacked purpose, their conversations, muted though they were, filled with tension. One man paced near the well, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder as if expecting an ambush. Another sat slumped against the wall, his head bowed low, shoulders shaking slightly as though crying silently. Even from afar, Ethan could sense the unease radiating from them. What haunted these men? Curiosity burned within him, urging him closer despite the risks. Using the cover of the forest, he crept nearer, staying low and silent as a predator stalking its prey. Each step brought him closer to answers, yet also deeper into danger. If discovered, there would be no escape. Not here, not now. Finally, he reached a vantage point just outside the clearing, hidden among the roots of a massive tree. From here, he could hear snatches of conversation carried on the wind. "Shouldn't have left him there," one voice muttered, barely audible. "Shut up, Jake," another snapped. "We did what we had to. No use crying over spilt milk." "But the water," Jake whispered, his tone trembling. "It ain't natural. None of it is." Ethan froze, his blood running cold. Water. The same word that had plagued the Miller Ranch echoed here, miles away in this secluded hideout. Could the two be connected? And if so, how? Before he could ponder further, a sudden commotion erupted from within the cabin. The door burst open, and a third man staggered out, clutching his arms though injured. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his temples as he gasped for breath. "It's happening again!" he cried, his voice laced with panic. "In the well. Something's down there." The other bandits exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado crumbling under the weight of fear. For a moment, none spoke, the silence heavy and oppressive. Then, as one, they turned and fled, disappearing into the forest without looking back. Ethan watched them go, his mind racing. Whatever had driven the Wanderers from their sanctuary was clearly something far beyond mere coincidence. And whatever it was, it had something to do with the well, and perhaps the water, summoning all his courage. Ethan stepped into the clearing, approaching the well with cautious steps. The air around it felt different, charged with energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Peering over the edge, he could see nothing but darkness, endless and impenetrable. Yet he knew instinctively that something lurked below, waiting patiently for its next victim. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a lantern, lighting it with steady hands. Holding it aloft, he leaned closer, shining the light down into the abyss. At first, there was only blackness. But then, ever so slowly, shapes began to emerge. Twisted, grotesque forms that defied understanding. Eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, watching him with an intelligence that chilled him to the bone. And then a voice, not spoken, but felt resonating deep within his mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern as shock coursed through him. His heart pounded wildly, threatening to burst from his chest. Whatever dwelled in the well was not human, or at least not anymore. It was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent, born of secrets buried long before the Wild West ever existed. Little did Ethan know this was only the beginning. The truth about the Wanderers, the skull in the trough, and the horrors hidden in the well would unravel in ways he could never have imagined. And when it did, nothing in Willow Creek or anywhere else would ever be the same again. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching his throat as the voice reverberated through his mind. The lantern trembled in his grip, its light flickering like a heartbeat. He forced himself to steady it, the rational part of his brain screaming at him to flee while he still could. But another part, a darker, more curious part, urged him to stay, to uncover the truth no matter the cost. The well loomed before him, a yawning mouth swallowing shadows and secrets alike. The glowing eyes within seemed to grow brighter, watching him with an unsettling intensity that made his skin crawl. Ethan swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the revolver holster at his side. Whatever was down there, it wasn't natural, and whatever had driven the Wanderers to such desperation must have been unspeakable. Taking a deep breath, Ethan knelt beside the well, lowering the lantern carefully into the darkness. The rope creaked under the weight, each foot of descent stretching the silence between them. His heart pounded louder with every passing second, echoing in his ears like a drumbeat of impending doom. When the light finally reached the bottom, what he saw froze him to the core. There, amidst the jagged rocks and muck, lay remnants of human bones, skulls, ribs, femurs, all twisted together in grotesque patterns. Some were fresh, their flesh still clinging to them in decayed strips. Others were ancient, bleached white by time and moisture. But what truly unnerved Ethan was the way the bones seemed to move, shifting ever so slightly as if alive. Shadows writhed across the surface, forming shapes that defied logic. Hands reaching out, mouths opening wide in silent screams. A low chuckle rose from the depths, sending shivers down Ethan's spine. "You see now," the voice whispered, colder than ice. "What they did, what you might do." Ethan jerked the lantern upward, pulling it back toward the surface as fast as his trembling hands would allow. Once it cleared the rim, he dropped it to the ground, stepping away from the well as though it might reach out and grab him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The Wanderers hadn't just dumped a body in the trough. They'd tried to bury something far worse. Something ancient. Something hungry. But why? And how had it found its way into the water supply at the Miller Ranch? The questions burned in his mind, but answers remained elusive. For now, survival took precedence. Turning on his heel, Ethan sprinted for cover of the forest, his boots crunching loudly against the leaves. Behind him, the laughter grew louder, taunting him with promises of doom. He didn't stop until he was deep among the trees, hidden once more by their gnarled trunks and twisting branches. Panting heavily, Ethan leaned against a tree, pressing a hand to his chest as though trying to calm his racing heart. His thoughts spun wildly, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. The skull in the trough, the Wanderers' camp, the horrors lurking well. It all pointed to some greater conspiracy, one rooted in darkness and despair. But who or what was behind it? And why had it chosen the Miller Ranch as its next target? As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan resolved to return to Willow Creek. The people there deserved to know the truth, even if they wouldn't believe him. Gathering his wits, he mounted his horse and set off, the journey home feeling longer and heavier than before. By late afternoon, Ethan arrived back at the Miller Ranch, finding Jacob and Samuel waiting anxiously near the house. Both men looked up sharply as his horse approached, relief washing over their faces when they recognized him. "Sheriff," Jacob called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've been worried sick. Did you find anything?" Ethan dismounted slowly, his expression grim. "More than I wanted to," he replied, his voice heavy with unspoken dread. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." Together, the three men walked to Trough, where Thunder stood nearby, his massive form tense and alert. Ethan gestured toward the water, which rippled faintly despite the lack of wind. "This isn't ordinary water," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Something unnatural lives in it. That's why your horse refused to drink. It sensed danger." Jacob frowned deeply, shaking his head. "Unnatural? You mean cursed or haunted?" "I don't know exactly what it is," Ethan admitted, "but it's old, older than any of us. And it's not confined to this ranch. I followed a trail north, to a place where the wanderers have been hiding. They left bodies in a well, trying to contain whatever it is. But it got free, and now it's here." Samuel's face paled, his hands clenching into fists. "So what do we do? Just let it spread? Let it take over everything?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We fight it, but first we need to understand it. We need to dig deeper, literally, into the earth, into history. Maybe there's a record somewhere, an old legend or warning about this thing. If we can figure out what it wants, maybe we can stop it." Jacob nodded slowly, determination replacing fear in his eyes. "All right, we'll start digging tonight. Whatever it takes, we'll get to the bottom of this." As twilight descended, the trio gathered tools and lanterns, preparing for the task ahead. The air grew thick with anticipation, charged with the weight of unknown dangers. Beneath the stars, they began excavating around the base of the trough, chipping away at layers of dirt and stone. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of shovels striking earth and the occasional call of nocturnal creatures in the distance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel let out a sharp cry. "I hit something." Dropping to his knees, he brushed away the remaining soil, revealing a metallic object half buried in the ground. Pulling it free, he held it up for inspection. A rusted key, its edges worn smooth by age. Engraved along its shaft were symbols Ethan didn't recognize. Strange markings that seemed to pulse faintly in the lantern light. "What is it?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed intently on the key. "But I think it's important. Very important." Little did they know, the key was just the beginning. What it unlocked would change their lives, and perhaps the fate of the entire region forever. The key glinted faintly in the lantern light, its strange engravings seeming to shift and writhe like living things. Ethan held it carefully, as though afraid it might bite or burn his skin. The symbols etched into its surface were unlike anything he'd ever seen, neither Native American nor European, but something older, more primal. They pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if responding to some unseen force. Jacob and Samuel stared at it in awe, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the lantern. "Where does it go?" Jacob asked finally, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over them. Ethan shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I have a feeling we'll find out soon enough." As if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled slightly, a low rumble reverberating through the earth. Thunder snorted nervously, stepping back from the trough with wide, frightened eyes. The water within rippled violently, spilling over the edges as though stirred by an invisible hand. "Something's coming," Ethan said sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. "Everyone stay calm." The rumbling grew louder, accompanied now by a chilling sound, a soft, melodic whispering that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. It wasn't words, exactly, but rather a series of tones, rising and falling like the call of some unearthly creature. The hair on Ethan's arm stood on end as the noise grew louder, wrapping around him like a physical presence. Then, without warning, the ground split open. A jagged crack appeared near the base of the trough, widening rapidly as dirt and rocks tumbled into the abyss below. From the depths rose a figure. Or at least, what could loosely be called a figure. It was hunched, misshapen, its form indistinct and shifting constantly, as though made of smoke or shadow. Eyes burned bright within its mass, glowing with an intelligence both ancient and cruel. "You've awakened me," it intoned, its voice resonating deep within their chests, bypassing ears entirely. "And now you will pay." Ethan reacted instantly, drawing his revolver and firing a shot directly at the entity. The bullet passed harmlessly through its form, eliciting only a low chuckle that sent shivers down his spine. "Steel cannot harm me," it sneered, its shape coalescing slightly to reveal long, skeletal fingers tipped with claws. "But I can certainly harm you." Before anyone could react, one of those clawed hands lashed out, striking the ground mere inches from where Samuel stood. The impact sent shockwaves rippling outward, throwing all three men off balance. Samuel fell hard against the trough, his cry cutting off abruptly as water splashed onto his face. "No!" Jacob shouted, lunging forward to pull his son away. But the water acted strangely upon contact, clinging to Samuel's skin like glue. He struggled futilely, trying to tear himself free, but the liquid seemed alive, pulling him closer to the edge of the trough. Ethan acted quickly, grabbing the key still clutched in his hand. Without hesitation, he plunged it into the water, driving it deep into the wooden structure of the trough. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening roar, the water erupted upward, forming a towering column that engulfed the entity completely. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that left everyone clutching their heads in agony. But the scream quickly turned to a gurgling wheeze as the water began to boil, steaming furiously. Within seconds, the entity dissolved entirely, reduced to nothing more than wisps of vapor that dissipated into the night air. For several moments, there was only silence. The water settled back into the trough, now perfectly still and clear once more. Thunder approached cautiously, lowering his head to take a tentative sip. This time, he drank deeply, his earlier reluctance forgotten. What just happened?" Samuel asked weakly, shaking visibly as Jacob helped him to his feet. "I think," Ethan began, his voice hoarse, "we just sealed away whatever that thing was. The key. It must have been designed specifically for this purpose. To trap it, bind it somehow. But why here?" Jacob demanded, his anger barely masking his fear. "Why our ranch? Why now?" Ethan sighed heavily, his mind racing through possibilities. "I don't know the full story yet," he admitted, "but I suspect it has something to do with the land itself. Maybe the Miller family unknowingly built their home atop some sacred or cursed site. Or maybe it was brought here deliberately, centuries ago, by someone who wanted to keep it contained." Samuel frowned, staring at the key still embedded in the trough. "So it's gone for good?" Ethan hesitated, unwilling to offer false reassurances. "I hope so," he said finally. But little did I know then how wrong I would turn out to be. Days passed, and life at the Miller Ranch gradually returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such an encounter. Thunder drank freely from the trough, his behavior no longer erratic. The crops began to thrive again, nourished by rains that seemed to fall more frequently now. Even the townsfolk of Willow Creek noticed a change in the air, though few could put their finger on exactly what it was. Yet Ethan remained uneasy, despite the apparent success of their efforts. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly defeated the entity. Instead, they had merely delayed its return, buying themselves a brief reprieve before the inevitable reckoning. His suspicions were confirmed one fateful evening when a stranger rode into town. The man was tall and lean, his face weathered by years spent under harsh skies. His clothes were simple but well-made, and his saddlebags bulged with items whose purpose Ethan couldn't immediately discern. As the stranger dismounted at the general store, Ethan felt an immediate sense of unease, as though the very atmosphere around him shifted whenever he moved. "Evening, Sheriff," the man said, tipping his hat politely as he approached. His voice carried a strange accent, neither southern nor northern, but something altogether different. Name's Elias Gray. I believe we may have business together. Ethan studied him closely, noting the way his eyes darted briefly toward the keys still lodged in the trough. What kind of business? He asked warily. Elias smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say I'm familiar with certain forces beyond the ordinary, forces that shouldn't exist. And judging by recent events, I'd wager you've already encountered one of them. Ethan's grip tightened reflexively on his revolver. Who are you really? He demanded. I told you, Elias replied evenly. My name is Elias Gray, and I'm here because I know what's lurking beneath your feet, and I intend to stop it one way or another. Little did Ethan know, Elias Gray was not alone in his pursuit. Across vast distances, other entities stirred, drawn inexorably toward the key and the power it represented. And while the battle at the Miller Ranch had ended in victory, it was only the first skirmish in a much larger war, one that would test the limits of courage, faith, and sanity for everyone involved. For now, though, Ethan could only watch as Elias disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind more questions than answers. The key waited silently in the trough, its engravings glowing faintly in the moonlight, as though counting down the hours until the next confrontation.